Welcome back to a special edition of Press the Button. Today, we're doing a deep dive into one of the most critical issues facing our country today, authority over America's nuclear arsenal in the final days of Donald Trump's presidency. Following last week's violent attack on the Capitol by pro-Trump insurrectionists, many aides and advisors close to the president began raising significant concerns about his mental state. One White House official described his behavior as that of a total monster. Another reported that Trump was so mad at his own vice president for not doing more to overturn the election that he, quote, couldn't see straight. Yet another said the president was in a bunker mentality and that he was refusing to be reasoned with. Given these concerns, it was reported last Friday that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi spoke to Joint Chiefs Chairman General Mark Milley about whether there were any available precautions for preventing an unstable president from initiating military hostilities or accessing the launch codes and ordering a nuclear strike, according to a letter from her office. But are there any safeguards for preventing an unstable President Trump from launching a nuclear strike before he leaves office? To make sense of it all, I'm here with Tom Kalina, Press the Button co-host and Plowshares Fund policy director, and former Secretary of Defense Dr. William J. Perry, Pentagon chief under President Bill Clinton, senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institute, and founder of the William J. Perry Project. Secretary Perry and Tom are the co-authors of the book, The Button: The New Nuclear Arms Race and Presidential Power from Truman to Trump. They recently wrote an op-ed for Politico titled, Trump Still Has His Finger on the Nuclear Button. This Must Change, in which they discuss this very issue. Secretary Perry, Tom, thank you for being here.
Good to be here, Michelle.
My pleasure.
So let's get right into it. Are there any safeguards against President Trump from deciding to use nuclear weapons? Can you walk us through this process of nuclear command and control?
Michelle, there are no safeguards against a presidential launch and against a President Trump launch before he leaves office. And that's by design. I think people need to understand that the whole system was designed for speed. These were concerns from the Cold War that we would get a surprise nuclear attack from the Soviet Union. The president would have just minutes to make a decision before the warheads landed. And so the system is designed for speed. He is followed 24/7, 365 by this military attaché who carries around the nuclear football, as we call it. It's a briefcase that contains everything the president needs to essentially call the war room in the Pentagon and over the phone or some other communication device, order a nuclear attack. The only thing he really has to do is identify himself as the president. And that's done by these codes that the president carries, called the gold codes. So the president has to identify himself that he is the president. And then from that perspective, the military follows the order. That's all that's really required. And then the president has to decide what he wants to do, right? And the football also contains a menu of sorts of options for types of attack that the president can order. And from that point, the officer in the war room then sends the messages out to the land-based ballistic missiles, the submarines, the bombers. All of that can happen in minutes. And again, that's why I emphasize that this system was designed for speed. And therefore, by design, there are no safeguards against an order from any president, including President Trump, from deciding to go nuclear.
I'd like to add that, first of all, what Tom described is exactly correct, and this is the way it would work. There have been two historical cases where it might not work that way. During the last few months of President Nixon's presidency, when he was drinking very heavily, this then Secretary of Defense Jim Schlesinger was very concerned that he might do something rash. And he called up the commander of the Strategic Air Command and told the general, if he gets a launch order from the president, he should do nothing until he consulted with him, Jim Schlesinger, the Secretary of Defense. Schlesinger did not know, and we knew, historically, we will never know whether the general would have followed that order or not. It gave Schlesinger some feeling of comfort to do that, but it's not at all clear it would have worked. Today, we have a similar situation where many people are concerned that an unstable president, unhinged president, as some have said, might do something crazy like that. Because of that situation, everybody's alert to the problem and concerned about it. Speaker Pelosi has contacted the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and asked him to be sure that a command did not go through. In that case, as in the case of Jim Schlesinger, we do not know, really, what the military would do. My best guess is that given the huge attention to the problem, given the concern everybody has about it, they would find some way of slow rolling it. I should emphasize, though, that if they did that, it would be illegal. It's not what they're authorized to do. And we cannot be sure that would happen. So the 2 points is it would be an illegal action. And secondly, we cannot be confident, and Nancy Pelosi cannot be confident that that request would be honored. So it's a better situation than in general, which is the situation that Tom described. I'm not as concerned as I would be because of the special circumstances and the attention and publicity surrounding this case. But I still say it's not a good situation. We cannot be sure the command would not go through.
If I could just add to that, I think we're putting the military in a very difficult position where they become the arbiter, right, of what is a legitimate launch order and what isn't. And it's kind of ironic historically that that's the case, because if we go back to President Truman, who essentially took this authority away from the military and put it in the president's hands, in a civilian leader's hands, we're kind of going back in history and saying, well, let's give this back now to military decision makers. To me, that's an abdication of civilian leadership responsibility by the president and Congress to say, no, Congress and the civilian leadership needs to lay down clear guidelines for what we think are the appropriate circumstances for using nuclear weapons. And that's what's missing here. Mm-hmm. And yes, we hope, as Bill said, that the military wouldn't follow through. But in a life and death situation like this, hope isn't enough. We need better safeguards.
Whether you believe these interventions, like Schlesinger and Pelosi, would be effective or not, would work or not, I think we can all agree it's a very unsatisfactory situation. And the thing to do is disestablish the president's sole authority. And we hope very much, and we're recommending that President Biden do that as one of his early acts in office. Not that we're concerned about President Biden's rash actions, but you cannot expect the rash president to be taking those actions. The decision to change this authority has to be made by a wise, temperate, stable president. And so, because he cannot know who will succeed him and who will be the next president. So we're counting very much on President Biden making the right decision and disestablishing sole authority.
So before we get into some of those changes, because I want to hear more about that, I want to go back into this historical bit. Secretary Perry, you raised that this is not the first time we have been concerned about a president's mental state and his authority over nuclear weapons. And Tom, to your point, putting the fate of the world in a single person's hands seems like a pretty obvious bug in the command and control system. So why was it designed that way? Why risk letting one person have ultimate command with no checks on their authority? Again,
the system was designed for speed, right? And so, and to me, it's a logic that doesn't hold up anymore. That we'd be willing to risk the inherent dangers of sole authority in exchange for a speedy decision. And the reason I say that risk isn't worth it, one is the Cold War's been over for 30 years. The Russians aren't going to attack us out of the blue. They know full well that it would be suicide to attack the United States, because we have an assured retaliation capability, even if we're attacked first, because our submarines are survivable at sea. So we're running the risk of sole authority to head off a scenario that I think is simply not credible. What is much more credible is that if there were any kind of warning of a nuclear attack, that would be a false alarm. And as Bill can attest, he's been part of false alarms in the past. And that is more likely, frankly, than a real attack. And in days where we are, where cyber attacks are becoming more numerous, false alarms are becoming more likely. And so we really want to build in more decision time, not less. We don't want presidents making quick decisions on sole authority to launch nuclear weapons on warning of attack when that warning could be a false alarm. So just that's a way of saying that the system was built for a scenario that we would say is no longer relevant and is quite dangerous.
As Tom has said, the original reason for sole authority had nothing to do with the timing of the decision. The situation was very different then. We were the only nuclear power. There was no concern about a nuclear attack on the United States. But in time, what enshrined sole authority and caused it to endure for decades and decades was the belief that we might have to act quickly. The president might have to make a decision in 5 minutes or so, and he did not have time to consult with Congress or with any other senior members of his staff. So that has become enshrined. But today, it seems to me that whatever else you think about our process and our system, I believe that the quick launch, the short launch decision, is a problem in and of itself. And that whatever else we do, we ought to get rid of the quick launch. One way, and therefore the thing that has justified the sole authority today, which is the quick launch, is actually a very undesirable factor. If you're about to take an action that's going to end our civilization, there's no need to rush into it. You do not need to make that kind of a decision in 5 minutes. If any decision deserves more time, more deliberation, more consultation, it's a decision which might end our civilization. So let's take some time to do it, particularly since historically we know that the impetus for a quick launch, the decision to make a quick launch, that historically the times it's happened, they've all been false alarms. And we can expect more false alarms in the future, particularly with the advent of cyber warfare. So false alarms is a serious problem. As Tom said, I experienced 2 of them myself back during the Cold War when I was Under Secretary of Defense. And one of them, I was awoken by a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning. And the first thing the general said to me was that his computers were showing 200 ICBMs on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. He quickly added that he had concluded it was a false alarm and he was not sending a launch command. But before he called me, he did not know that. And he had called the White House to alert them to the problem. So we were within minutes away of the president having to decide whether to launch our missile. Had he decided to launch them, he would, of course, have accidentally started a nuclear war. Had he decided not to launch them, the reason he was worried about not launching them is that if he did not launch them, ICBMs would be destroyed in their silos. The strange situation here, which people tend to overlook or never did know about, was that when ICBMs were originally built, they were put into silos with tons and tons of reinforced concrete to protect them from a surprise attack. And in the first decade or so after they were deployed, that in fact worked. But since then, both we and the Soviet Union and later Russia have developed guidance systems with accuracy enough to make nearly direct hits of the silos. So they do not protect them anymore. So what turned out to be an invulnerable basing system is now a highly vulnerable system. But yet we persist in keeping these missiles deployed. Tom and I have both recommended that we phase out our ICBMs for just the reason of their vulnerability. And because of that vulnerability, their tendency to want to use them early in the case of an attack.
So then this gets me back to the point that you were making earlier. What can we do to fix these problems, plural? Not just in the case of Trump. You've made it clear that there's really not much we can do at this point, but for all future presidents in terms of these risks.
Well, so sure, in the President Trump current situation, with an unhinged president in the White House, what we're really worried about is his sole authority to launch nuclear weapons first. So you can split that into two parts and address them separately. So if we had a policy that said the president cannot use nuclear weapons first, in other words, there would have to be a nuclear attack on the United States before the United States could use nuclear weapons, we would feel a lot better right now about Trump in the White House, because there has been no nuclear attack in the United States. There will not be a nuclear attack on the United States. So that is a clear guideline that the military can follow. Any order to launch nuclear weapons in the absence of a nuclear attack on the United States shall not be followed. So that is a case for the utility of a no first use declaration right now in the current situation. You could also address the other part of this, the sole authority part. And you can say, well, as we've been saying, the time for sole authority has passed. This is now just a dangerous, unnecessary vestige of the Cold War. And what we need is shared authority between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Congress should share that authority with the president. So any decision to launch would have to be both a presidential decision and a congressional decision. That would also really help the current situation, right? Because it would be very clear that unless Congress concurred, there could be no presidential launch decision. Again, so both of those are clear directives that the military can clearly see, go, no go. And both of those things would be tremendously better from a clarity, safety, security perspective than the vague gray area that we find ourselves in today with an unmoored President Trump in the White House.
Michelle, to oversimplify the issue, we hope and believe that the Vice President Biden, when he becomes president, will take two actions. The first of them is disestablish sole authority, as we have discussed. And secondly, establish sole use. Establish that the sole use of nuclear weapons is for deterrence. Those two together would have the effect of making us much, much safer and pretty much reduce the risk of an accidental nuclear war.
In addition to hoping that President-elect Biden will take the steps that Bill just described, we're also hoping that Congress will get involved here. And in fact, there's legislation on both those aspects I described, the no first use and the shared authority, that we think are worth Congress forwarding and passing. One is Senator Warren and Congressman Adam Smith have a bill to declare the no first use policy of the United States. That bill needs to be reintroduced in the new Congress, and we hope it will be. And the other bill would create shared authority between the legislative and executive branches. And that bill is sponsored by Senator Markey and Congressman Ed Lieu, which we expect to be reintroduced very soon. And I think it's important that there be legislative backup to whatever President-elect Biden does. Because as we know, presidents can make policies and then the next president can change it. I think it's very important that Congress back that up as much as it can through either or both of those legislative remedies. So we want both the new administration and the new Congress to act. Look, we understand that it's difficult for presidents to restrict their own authorities. And that's why we've had sole authority for 75 years, right? Ever since President Truman took that authority for himself, every president has taken on that authority. and not restricted it. So we understand that presidents are not in the business of restricting their own authority, but we feel strongly that in this case, given the situation we're in today, right now, with an unhinged president in the White House, we're hopeful that President-elect Biden will see the inherent dangers of this situation and take it upon himself to declare restrictions, safeguards on presidential launch, not because he is a danger, but because we could have future President Trumps. We could have future presidents that are in this situation, just as we've had previous situations and presidents in this situation. So we can't assume that that we will never see this situation again. And so I think that becomes a very compelling motivation for the new administration to fix this for future administrations and future generations.
That's all the time we have. I'd like to thank both Secretary Perry and Tom for being here to talk about this critical issue. Thank you so much for jumping on.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle. Really appreciate it.
And to our listeners, if you'd like to read more on this issue, be sure to check out their Politico piece and their new book, The Button, The New Nuclear Arms Race and Presidential Power from Truman to Trump. You'll find links to both in the podcast notes.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.